This is a short video about connectivity. I think it will interest anyone who has actually more than one piece of hardware. As soon as you get more than a couple of pieces of hardware, synthesizers, desktop modules, effects units, effects pedals, then the question of connectivity arises, and this will have faced every musician who has more than a few pieces of gear. Now, I can't solve your connectivity problems because that is extremely personal to you, the way you want to work and the gear you have. But I will give you 3 examples of setups which may or may not work for you. There are many ways of connecting your gear. I would like to share 2 examples from my own personal experience, and I will point you to one super example of connectivity which I think might inspire you. So what we're talking about here is how you control the gear you have and how you record it into what is probably going to be a computer, into your DAW, although I know some people use tape machines. If you had to use a tape machine back in the 80s, I'm not totally sure that you would still want to use one now, but maybe you would. That's totally up to you. But as soon as you find yourself with more than a couple of pieces of gear, you will run into the connectivity question, a problem which needs to be solved. Now let's start with the mega example, and this video in fact was prompted by a studio tour by Alex Ball. You're probably familiar with him. I hope you subscribe to his channel. He makes lots of super videos, mainly about vintage synthesizers, but not always. And in his super studio tour video, which of course I will link to in the description, he not only showed us what he has, the gear, but how it was connected together. And I thought this was just as interesting as the gear he had. Now, it's not much of a spoiler alert, but essentially he had a main mixer. He had 2 auxiliary mixers, which he called coloured mixers. They were analog mixers which coloured the sound deliberately, of course. He probably had other mixers as well. He had a multi-port MIDI interface and an audio patch bay. He also had a collection of effects pedals. And through a series of what must have been very well planned and well thought out options, he is able to connect just about everything to everything else, so he can play just about any piece of gear through any of the pedals, record any of them into the DAW, control any piece of gear from his DAW. It is probably one of the most interconnected studios out there. Now, if you're not familiar with Alex Ball, do check out his channel. He produced a series of videos, a retrospective of some of the big synth companies such as Roland and ARP. They are TV documentary quality. I mentioned some of them in one of my videos, which was 17 videos every synth enthusiast should watch. That will also be linked in the description, of course. And just to say one more thing, he has an absolutely massive Roland 100M system. He even has modules which don't exist. Really, check out the video, see what he has to say about them. You can dive further into that if you want to in his videos. Now, my first proper synthesizer, if you like, was the Roland 100M system. Mine has long since gone, but I did make a video about it. I think it's the very first video on my channel if you want to check that out. I'm not going to link to it. You have to scroll right to the bottom of the page to find it. It's terrible video, the lighting is terrible, but there's information about my first studio, my 1980s studio. Anyway, to get back to the issue of connectivity, this is what I did, or what I had to do back in the 80s. I had the Roland 100M system, I had an Elka organ, I had a Roland Space Echo 501, the big one, I had a Dramatics Roland drum machine, and I had a couple of effects pedals, and I had a TX 4-track tape recorder. Now, to connect all this gear together, I had a really small passive mixer, and it wasn't so much that the technology was available at the time, it was how shallow my pockets were. So if I wanted to run the synth through the Space Echo, I had to connect it to the Space Echo, run the Space Echo into the mixer, and that would go into the TIAC. If I wanted to record the dramatics on its own, I had to unplug the Space Echo, plug that into the mixer, and you get the picture. It was time-consuming and laborious, but that's what I did. A mixer would certainly have helped. I did get a proper mixer in my 1990s studio, but that is what I had, that is what I used, and that is what I did. And I suspect if you only have a couple of pieces of gear, or maybe more than a couple, you will spend a lot of time running around behind the gear, patching one thing to another. Now, when I was building up this studio, that is exactly what I did, but I very, very soon realised that this is not the best option. For one thing, and this is something which comes up in a lot of videos, if you have to run around repatching gear, it can take the edge off the creative flow, and that is really something you do not want to do. So it makes a lot of sense to set up your gear so it does what you want it to do when you want it. So the first thing you need to do is to decide exactly what you want it to do. Now, Alex's studio is, I would say, fully connected both via MIDI and audio. Now, you may notice that I have a few bits of gear in the corner. I call that my modular corner, and I have some synthesizers and desktop modules behind me. Now, here's something which may surprise you or not. None of these are connected via MIDI. Well, yes, the modules are connected to a keyboard via MIDI, but that's it. They are not connected to the computer or the DAW or anything else. Why is that, Ian? Well, I'm glad you asked. When I started to put all this stuff together, I didn't really have the intention of controlling it from a DAW. Harking back to the 1980s, the only way to record music was to play it live, so that's what I expected to do. So everything, all these synths and all the synths over there are connected to the main mixer one way or another via audio, but there is no direct MIDI connection. I can control something via MIDI from the computer if I want to, from my Native Instruments keyboard. That is the only MIDI interface that I currently have. So I could record something into Cubase, take the MIDI out from the keyboard and plug that into one of these bits of gear. I think I've done that a couple of times since I've had all this stuff. And yes, that does involve a certain amount of patching, with one lead actually, but it's not something I do frequently enough to warrant putting together a whole interconnected system. Now, the connectivity that you want may well be different. You may want to control all your synthesizers, even the keyboard synthesizers, from your computer, in which case that is a different scenario altogether. And there are two issues here which sometimes seems to be connected, if you'll pardon the expression, together. One is controlling gear via MIDI, and the other is the audio routing, the outputs from your gear, whether they go into an effects unit or directly into an audio interface and into your DAW. In my situation, I've connected the modular gear directly to the main mixer. All the synths behind me go into a Behringer, I think it's an RX1602, it's a line mixer. Why there are not more mixers like this around, I do not know. It is essentially an 8 stereo channel line mixer, so you can connect 8 stereo signals into it, get one output which you can then record or put into your main mixer. I made a video about this unit which I think is worth watching if you're on the market for a line mixer. Link down there. So if you find yourself continuously running behind your gear, rearranging audio or MIDI cables, it may be time to think about a more permanent and flexible solution. There's nothing worse than being dragged away from your creative flow in order to repatch or reconfigure a piece of equipment. Now, as I've said, every situation will be different, every studio will be different, it will contain different bits of gear, and you, the user, will want to connect it and use it in different ways. There are dozens of MIDI interfaces and MIDI routers out there. There are dozens of audio interfaces and audio patch bays. So however you want to connect your gear together, there will almost certainly be solutions for you. So it's important you decide what you want to do before you actually do it. Quite often, the simplest solutions, as they say, are the best. But if you find yourself running around the back of your gear to remake connections, it may be time to think about a better and more flexible solution. Now, I've only mentioned one piece of connecting gear in this video. That's the Behringer line mixer. If you use a particular mixer or router or patch bit in your setup and find it useful, then please do mention it in the comment section. I'm sure a lot of viewers will find it very useful. And that, at the moment at least, is all I have to say about that. Happy connecting.